Hello and welcome to Let's Review. Quite a while back, all the way back in episode 4 of this show in fact, I reviewed Bound by Flame, an RPG that was made by the studio Spiders. And overall, I quite liked it. Mars Warlogs was the game that Spiders created prior to Bound by Flame. And since I quite enjoyed looking back over a developer's previous work to see what lessons they learned, I figured I'd give it a go. So the question is, how much did they learn? Well, to answer that, let's start with the gameplay. Mars Warlogs is an action RPG set on the planet Mars, and the main thrust of its gameplay is its combat system.
When you encounter a group of enemies in Mars Warlogs, you will have a number of options. For example, you can start off by being a little bit stealthy. So I've entered stealth mode here, and I can try and get an early strike on this first guard, which in that case did not work. From here, everything goes hand to hand. So for example, I'm getting attacked by these guys, and I'm using the block function to avoid taking too much damage. There's this guy at the back, who is using a nail gun to act as a sort of sniper type enemy, so it's worth taking him out early. You can also theoretically counter the enemy if you time your blocks perfectly. However, the system is a little dodgy at times, so actually timing them perfectly, like that, is usually more a matter of luck than actual skill. In addition, once you reach a certain point in the game, you can gain access to special powers. So for example, I can do this in order to disable that enemy and deal some damage. Now that is an ally of the enemies. It's classified as a dog. In that classic sci-fi, we're calling an animal that isn't actually an earth animal an earth animal. You can also pause the game or slow it down severely, which will allow you to assess the enemy's current state, as well as take health potions or use abilities that you haven't mapped to the bar. So for example here, I will use a quick health injection, which doesn't restore my health instantly, it just massively increases its recharge rate for a very brief period. Now this dog is protected from the front, which means in order to defeat it, I've got to combat roll behind it and strike it from the back. And you'll notice it automatically dodged me after a couple of attacks there. And fundamentally, that is the combat system for Mars Warlogs.
In addition to this, it also has a pretty solid crafting system.
The crafting system is fairly intuitive. So for example, my current weapon is this iron bar. Now, I have currently got attached to it some Queen Claws, which increase its physical damage significantly, as well as giving it a wounding chance, which is roughly equivalent to bleeding damage from a lot of other games. If I had sufficient crafting materials, I could charge it with, say, an electro mace, a dynamo, a nailed line, and various other things, and you'll notice that each of these have different physical properties, as well as adjusting the appearance of the weapon. The same goes for the handle, so I could put on, say, a guard, which would lock around there, and would increase my damage protection. In addition to being able to modify the weapons, you can also modify the clothes you're wearing. So again, shoulders, forearms, and knees. So again, I don't have many crafting materials at the moment, but there are some of the various options. And the higher level your armor, the more options are available. This is about mid-tier armor, so I've got a few options, but there are certainly more that come up later in the game. And that's basically the crafting system. It's pretty good on the whole.
If you're thinking that all that looked very familiar, then you've probably seen the Bound by Flame review. Mars Warlogs is very, very similar to Bound by Flame in a lot of regards, although they definitely tightened it up in Bound by Flame. Now that's not to say that Mars Warlogs is sloppy, just a little less refined. The leveling system too is very familiar.
The leveling system works by assigning you 2 points per level, which you can put into a number of abilities which are split into 3 trees. We have the combat tree, where we can improve things like our ability to parry, our raw damage, the effectiveness of our evasions, and so on and so forth. Then we have the Renegade tree, which is more focused on stealth-based abilities using different weapons such as the nail gun to increase hits damage, or making things like our basic sand throw ability slightly better and improving our first aid. About a third of the way into the game, so at the end of Act 1, you'll gain access to the Technomancy tree, which allows you to throw around lightning-based attacks, as well as simple force throws. And again, this can be improved to improve things like our electrical attacks, allowing them to bounce between multiple targets, and eventually lead us to an overload ability. In addition, we also gain a single feat point per level, which allows us to acquire different skills. So for example, in this build, I've got all three of the perks for Quick Learner, Combat Spirit, and Combat Genius, which increase the amount of experience I get for defeating enemies. There are also ones for unlocking new craftable items, improving the efficiency of our recycling, and later ones that relate to the reputation system. However, it is worth noting that in my entire playthrough, my reputation never changed from neutral for whatever reason. And that's basically it for the leveling system.
In Bound by Flame, you learned fire magic, whereas in Mars Warlogs, you learned to throw around arcs of electricity. Overall, it's broadly similar, although this time you'll be looking more at things like stun chance rather than burning damage. At the end of the day, both sets of powers feel very good and they work well, and ultimately, I kind of prefer the electrical powers from this game. That being said, there is one thing that I do find quite irksome about the gameplay, and that's the amount of backtracking that it makes you do.
The maps for each area are reasonably extensive, and each act usually has several interconnected smaller maps. That being said, the game does have a very annoying habit of making you go back and forth a lot. So for example, the quest Mean Dogs requires me to go to the crater. In order to complete it, you will have to go back and forth between the crater and the central area repeatedly, as well as to other areas. The sheer amount of backtracking it makes you do does start to get quite annoying after a while. And while the levels are reasonably sized, having to have loading screens in between the different sections gets quite annoying after a while.
Overall, the gameplay is pretty good. It's got its problems, sure, but for the most part it's reasonably enjoyable. And even though its flaws are there, they never really detract from the experience too much. Overall, I like it for the same reasons that I liked Bound by Flame's combat system, although this one is noticeably better balanced, so you don't have to worry about the excessive difficulty of its successor. Ultimately, I like the combat system, and while it holds up reasonably well, the question then becomes, does the story? The story begins with a young man named Innocence Smith, who's travelling on a train towards a POW camp. There, he meets Roy, a prisoner who intends to escape the camp, and the player then takes control of Roy and sets out to fulfill his escape plan, eventually leading to him becoming an important figure in the future of the planet. Ultimately, the story for this game suffers from many of the problems that its successor did, namely that although it tries for a sense of scale, because a lot of important events happen off-screen, you never really feel that. Its choice system also bugs me in a way. In what way specifically? It's too binary most of the time. Take, for example, when I was asked to deal with a traitor to the Resistance. My options were to leave him running things or to kill him. And I would have preferred to have an option number 3 where I threw him out without having to actually kill him. It's also got the same tacked-on romance subplot business from Bound by Flame, and I said it in that review, but if you're not going to take sufficient time and effort to make the romances work properly, don't include them. All it does is make your game worse. In addition, one of the major driving forces of the plot is sadly poorly explained, and that's the Technomancers, a mysterious group who use technology to simulate magic and keep the populace in fear. Yep. Oh, and let me guess.
the main character is a former member of this group, is he not?
Spot on as usual. Here's the thing. Overall, the story of Mars Warlogs isn't bad, it's just not fleshed out enough. It's lacking certain elements. I think if they'd had more time with it, we could have had something really interesting here. But as it stands, it's too skeletal. It needed more backstory, better devotion to some of the subplots, and more time to interact with the characters. Ultimately, I think the game needed to be about another third as long, probably. Somewhere in the region of 10 to 12 hours rather than the 7 or 8 you get. The overall style of the game has a very run-down feel to it. Everything you see feels like it's been cobbled together from spare parts, which does definitely match the feel of a society on the verge of collapse. This is particularly true in the design of things like the weapons, which are all very primitive. It's things like copper pipes and steel bars that have had nails strapped to them. They're all very improvised, and they do give a healthy feeling of weight to the proceedings. That being said, it would have been nice if later in the game you actually started to get proper weapons to really make you feel like you were advancing as a character, but that's a fairly minor quibble, and at the end of the day, the art style works for the tone they were trying to set, which is the most important thing. Mars Warlogs is no great looker in the graphics department. It's not particularly bad, but it's not fantastic either, and some of the facial animations in particular feel a little weird at times. Performance-wise, it runs pretty well. It's very smooth, it runs at a very happy 30 to 60 frames per second without any major problems, and there weren't any major bugs that I encountered that are worth mentioning. Overall, it runs very nicely, and it's not too much of a system hog, so even if you're running an older machine, you shouldn't run into any major problems. The voice acting for this game is somewhat mixed. Some of it's pretty good, and some of it is hilariously bad. The Technomancer leader, who incidentally never gets a name, is hilariously badly voice acted. It's the kind of thing that you have to see to really believe it. As for the rest of the audio, well, the music's pretty good overall, and the quality of the sound effects is pretty decent. You've got some very weighty thuds of impact, and the sounds that the electrical attacks make are generally pretty damn good. So, did I enjoy Mars Warlogs? Yes, I did. Should you buy it? Honestly, yes, I think you should. Now, don't get me wrong, it's definitely flawed, but if you can pick it up for a reasonably cheap price, I would absolutely recommend it. I still see serious potential in this studio if they can get past some of their bad hang-ups. If they're willing to spend the time to make a really good length RPG and polish it well, I think they could create something really, really good. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's Halloween, which means Martin and I need to plan out what we're doing tonight. I will see you later. You know, I was kind of expecting today to be a little sort of busier.
Oh, Halloween is largely unimportant. Well, unless you happen to be American at any rate.
Oh?
Well, their fascination with this time tends to draw a lot of attention, spiritually speaking. Rather draws the heat away from the rest of us, at least for a short period.
Fair enough. Fancy dinner in town tonight, then?
I could be tempted, yes.
Excellent. I'll go get my coat.